Thank you. It sounds like a tin can up here. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Am I too loud? All right, thanks. The ontology of death is universal, hence archetypal. Nowhere do we witness any organic creature escape its talons. Analytical psychology has had an intimate relation to death for the simple fact that it contemplates the soul, the numinous, and an afterlife. From Hegel to Heidegger, Freud, and Jung, death was an existential force that sustained and transformed life, the positive significance of the negative. Rather than merely a destructive phenomenon, death informs being, the power of nothingness that dialectically drives life. In this presentation, I'll introduce the notion of what I call the omega principle, the psychological orientation and trajectory of our being towards death. What we may say is the universal preoccupation and recapitulation of the collective unconscious that subsumes our personal relation to death, an eternal return of the objective psyche constellated as essa in anima. The philosophy of death. No words can placate, intellectualize, or rationalize away our private encounter with death. For life hangs by a hair, de pilo pendit. Despite the impersonality of death and our brute rational acceptance of the implacability of finitude, logos cannot prevent the inevitable. Although there is an inherent teleology to both life and death, death becomes our final aim and destiny. In the somber words of Quintilian, everything that is born passes away. Defecare omni quod nascere. The fantasy of a return goes back to the ancients. The primordial cosmic unity, the Neoplatonic one, the myth of the eternal return, the eschaton, all have to do with the fantasy of a return to origins. The return fantasy has metaphysically and symbolically conditioned culture since the time of civilization, such as in the need for a cosmogonic ordering principle, a godhead, or eternity. Like the view that the cosmos has always been infinite, aneta, and uncaused, such as in the Vedic tradition, or its permutation is the Ein Sof in Kabbalah. And for the Neoplatonists, all that exists, the many, is contingent upon the one as an unconditioned unity that conditions all unity. Here one is a unity of singularity that conditions all being. Singularity as unitarity is the essence of anything that exists, as the existence of all things is being. Yet the one is indivisible and is the original cause of being. There is no division, no separation, no difference within pure identity. It embraces the simplicity thesis of the rudimentary presence of identity, where everything is collapsed into solitariness. The solitary is also further intimately connected to the notion of nothingness as, quote, that which is not one, end quote. That's from Plato, which Plotinus espouses in the Aeneid. Only one exists, or it is nothing. So we either return to one or have never left it. Symbiosis, the merger fantasy, a return to a tensionless state, all presuppose a cosmogony of holism, a participatory metaphysics with divinity, a heavenly Eden, or its equivalent in other religions, and peace, hence death, tensionlessness. Jung on death. The Chilean diplomat and writer Miguel Serrano, who had traveled widely in India studying yoga, and who had close friendships with Jung and the poet Hermann Hesse towards the end of their lives visited Jung less than 1 month before his death at his house in Kuzna. In his interview with Jung, in his study, he describes how, quote, Jung was seated beside the window, dressed in a Japanese ceremonial gown, so that in the light of the late afternoon he looked like some magician or a priest from an ancient cult. Can't you just imagine seeing that? After giving him a gift, Serrano said that he had just come from visiting Hesse, where they had talked about death. I asked Hesse whether it was important to know if there was something beyond death. Hesse had said that he thought not, that he thought that death was probably like entering the collective unconscious, falling into it, perhaps. Jung replied, Your question was badly put. It would be better phrased in this way. Is there any reason to believe that there is life after death? And is there? Responded Serrano. Were it possible for the mind to function at the margin of the brain, it would be incorruptible. Is such a thing possible? Parapsychological phenomena suggest that it is. I myself have experienced certain things which also indicate it. Once I was gravely ill, almost in a coma. Everybody thought that I was suffering terribly, but in fact, I was experiencing something extremely pleasant. I seemed to be floating over my body, far above it. Then after my father died, I saw him several times. Of course, that does not mean that he in fact appeared. His appearances may have been entirely subjective phenomena on my part. Jung is so good at qualifying everything. Just slips away from the real empirical and metaphysical questions. Jung was referring to his space dream he reported in Memory, Dreams, and Reflections after he suffered a heart attack and had a near-death experience where he had the most profound sense of euphoria merging with the cosmos. Serrano continued, but isn't it possible that all these things are in fact external and objective and not merely something which happens in the mind? Hesse talks about the collective unconscious as if it is existing, or if it existed externally, and he considers that death may merely be a falling into that state. In a lecture Jung gave at a Basel Psychology Club, he was asked the question of whether or not we can assume that individual consciousness continues after death. Although he replied that we can never know that, he offered, quote, an opinion about it with the help of the unconscious, end quote, for, quote, the unconscious obliges and produces dreams which point to continuation of life after death, end quote. Jung had reported dreams and several experiences of psychic phenomena associated with people who died or were about to die. But in his famous face-to-face interview with John Freeman for BBC television, Jung questions if death really is an end because the psyche, he asserts, is not confined to space and time, nor is it subjected to those laws, hence pointing toward a psychical existence beyond the material world as a continuation of life. And in an interview with the English journalist Jordan Young just before Jung's 85th birthday, Jung states, quote, "It is just as legitimate to believe in life after death as it is to doubt it." Being towards death. Heidegger asks whether we can obtain an ontologically adequate conception of death as an existential question, belonging to the character of Dasein, or the human subject as being in a world. As being at an end, zu Ende sein, in death, we must face the existential nature of our lived experience as a particular understanding of ourselves. the peculiar relation that we have is only as being towards death, Sein zum Tode, which is a form of authentic relatedness to one's inexistence that is yet to come. Because existence by definition is incomplete, only the actuality of death may be complete, hence total, final, or whole. But any gain in becoming whole becomes at the loss of being. Heidegger tells us, quote, Dasein must as itself become, that is to say, be what it is not yet. Because the denial of death underlies an unconscious anxiety we'd rather not focus on, the demands of living an authentic life beckons the brute need to ponder and reflect on death as a value that informs our concrete existence that will come to an end. And this aspect of our ontological thrownness should become a moral impetus to improve our lives through genuine comportment, what Heidegger calls the still inner voice of conscience. Unlike Jung, the value of life therefore lies in the realization that it's temporary, which summons our own most authentic potentiality for being a whole, as the very meaning of its being as care. A caring that extends to all of our activities. To care is that something matters now. In other words, to be is to care as a primordial relation to temporality. Death is the end of time, the end of agency, hence no longer being there as Dasein. Death looms as the impending not yet. We are thrown towards as part of our existential condition, the ontology of the not, where negation suffuses the very fabric of our essential being. Ending, stopping, perishing, exiting, being used up, passing over into, finishing, expiring, demising, are euphemisms and signifiers of the no more. Death is the phenomena of life, is the privative relation to our lived encounters, even though we don't know what death is like. Epistemic erasure. We don't know, yet at the same time know. The barring of subjectivity, the foreclosure of being. For Heidegger, quote, death is a way to be, which Dasein takes over as soon as it is. Here death becomes a negative totality with a positive valence. For non-being is predisposed in any discourse on living. This finishedness, this disappearing we face, that which is outstanding, becomes a basic state of being human, which saturates the fundamental characteristics of our being in the world. One, existence as being, quote, ahead of itself. Two, facticity as being already in. And three, falling as being alongside everyday entities within the world. Being towards the end as the phenomenology of the not yet is a basic comportment of who we are as that which is distinctively impending, stands before us, and is there with us. The question therefore becomes, how do we live and understand our impending death? It is only in our own most potentiality for being as a solitary mode of authentic self-relatedness that we can ever come to offer an adequate answer, the task of individuation. The Omega Principle. Heidegger insists that the topic of a metaphysic of death lies outside the domain of an existential analysis of death. That's a complete contradiction, by the way. But I must demur. Can we posit a destructive element to the collective psyche that mirrors the destructive forces we observe in the physical world on a cosmic plane. I have something more in mind than Freud's concept of the death drive or Jung's notion of universal shadow. What if everything revolves around endings? The end is recapitulation, eternal repetition, an infinite finitude reimposed on a metaphysical level that saturates all being. From non-consciousness, nothingness, we emerge only to unconsciously resume, hence restore as reappearance of our nascent beginning. Nothingness saturates existence in order for nothing to exist forever. In other words, nothingness conditions being. We have no real permanence, no comfort or ontological security, for everything is transient and decays from dust to dust. We have our moments of lived experience, such as pleasure, satisfaction, and enjoyment, jouance, as we do suffer, pathos. But it all comes to an end in our finite lives. The depressing anecdote is fraught by the defensive, hence wishful posit of a futurity without ending, an afterlife or eternal life, the seduction of immortality as a transcendental illusion that provides some reprieve from the austerity of the hopelessness of eluding death. We do not want to face this predetermined ontological thrownness, the certainty of non-being we are destined to embrace with or without consent. That is why psychic activity is in the service of displacement. We all want to escape from death, even if by suicide. By replacing inexistence through allusion to some other extant object or realm, substituting or transferring it onto something else, as it were, we are constantly reinforcing the primacy of the negative. But can we go farther? What if nothingness is existence? That being is literally no thing. Everything is timeless, eternal process within a sea of beings or entities that are temporally curtailed in their being. The cosmological one, the whole, the absolute, is really a series of perishings of objects and subjects, merging within its origins as non-consciousness, non-being, or nothingness. We know nothing of where we come from, only that we find ourselves here and will aspire. This is not the same question as the empirical biological explanation of birth from a reproductive organism. It is about the equiprimordiality of existence born from the via negativa, the ontology of the not. The end is ontologically imbued from the start, what we might call the omega principle, the spiral that begins and ends as a return to itself as interiorized negativity. We are governed by it the moment we're born and are causally destined to return to nothingness. Unlike Parmenides and Lucretius, who says that nothing comes nothing, because everything is teleologically oriented to die, to perish, to be expunged from existence, and yet this is the cycle of existence. This places nothingness at the center of being. I am nothing. I have no self. I have no permanence. I'm merely a mirage of attachments to perceptions and ideas that are temporary and ephemeral, says the Buddhist sage, referring to the illusion of being, the void, nothing, is the absolute ontological principle. Here I'm merely a facsimile or a hologram of existence, not a real entity, but rather an epiphenomenon of the pervasive inner disbursement of the negative. Bioscience confirms that we're dying the minute we are born, that cells are deteriorating as we grow, and that we are headed for a gurney with a toe tag. Here death saturates life, It telegraphs the inevitable when we cast eyes on an old person, or when I look in the mirror. When we encounter death for the first time as a child, we are told that person is no longer alive, hence no longer exists. They simply vanished. And we know intuitively in our interior that the end is causally determined, and it's just a matter of time before it's my turn. This produces such existential anxiety for the masses that we have the need to invent God, to mollify the worries of small children with transcendental promises of heaven, and placate social collectives through the advent of religion. But we all die the same. Even an imbecile knows that there is a brute terminus imposed upon us against our will. The Omega principle acts within the organism as negative interiority, within our social collectives as privation, aggression, and destructiveness, is embedded within the concept of world as deterioration and regeneration. And in the cosmos itself is the ontological necessity of entropy. Why? Because reality is process and is never static, an eternal series of passing away out of and returning to nothingness. And because we lack the primal presence of absence that can never be satiated or fulfilled, we are always metaphysically immersed in non-being. I personally see no overarching purpose or disambiguation we can assign to death other than the meanings we generate for ourselves. Just like our birth and our miraculous astronomical thrownness into a life-supporting universe, it merely happens. Even if we grant death the final cause of existence, understanding does not take away from the human angst it generates. Here, death should be respected as an incentive to live life while you can, as banal as it is. And this means to maximize the cultivation and incorporation of experience. In our being toward passing, namely the here and now presence of our felt relation to a future ending, comes the realization that our time here on earth is precious, for death is the end of becoming. If the aim of all life is death, then we're all preparing for rest, a tensionless state where we no longer feel anxiety and suffer, the culmination and fulfillment of life. God was invented to extinguish our suffering. Here there is no difference. Death is the terminus of pain. In other words, death is eternal peace, the end to all negativity and conflict, the cessation of our pathos. From nothing we emerge, and into nothingness we return. Here we may say that death is becoming unconscious, or in Hesse's and Heidegger's words, falling into that state of the timeless, eternal, collective aborigine. Thank you for listening.